week and next week. Don't clap or say amen. And then I'll be done. And because of that limited amount of time, there's something, and I have just several verses left to share. And talking about the eternal state. Today we're going to look at the nations and the glory they bring into the eternal state from the kingdom, and what we will actually be doing in the eternal state, which is probably what most of your questions are. What will we be doing? What will life be like? So we're going to look at that this morning, but I wanted to just kind of introduce this to you. I didn't get a chance to type it up and all that, but just to let you know kind of, if you can read that, where I'm going. We talked last week, if you weren't here, about having a sort of apologetic outline that you could share with somebody who sees the Bible as a myth. You know, it's just a religious book, it's a myth, it was written by men, and, you know, all that sort of thing to control people. And we were talking about trying to get an outline together where you can have a short, concise sort of discourse with somebody to get them think about the Bible. And so this is sort of just some thoughts I scribbled down. And then, like I said, I'll type this out and I'll give it to you, and we'll go over it next week. But I just want to kind of introduce it, your perspective. Naturally speaking, the Bible is not a book. Don't think of your Bible as a book, right? Think of it as a library of 66 books that record historical events from creation to the consummation of history. You have a library, not a book, right? Your presupposition, and remember, everybody has them. Even the person that you're going to be talking to, they're presupposing something already before they even talk to you. So everybody has a presupposition. Just admit yours, that you believe the book is a supernatural book. And once you give this outline, it'll start maybe getting them to question. Not only its claims to be supernatural, and we know the scriptures, it's God-breathed and all that sort of thing, that God breathed records of true history is what we're talking about, what we're looking at. And I tried to alliterate this because Andrew loves when I alliterate with P's. So I tried to keep all of this all P's, right? The period, over 1,600 years, these books were compiled and written. Think about this. Think about how many people, if you get 4 or 5 of you together in the room, think about trying to get all of you, just you 5, to agree on one thing. Now broaden that. Here you have 66 books written over a period of 1,600 years on 3 different continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe, by various types of people, fishermen, herdsmen, doctors, politicians, and such. 3 different languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. It deals with prophecies such as Cyrus the Great, who was predicted and called out by name 800 years, I think, beforehand. Daniel's history of the nations, you see, recorded in chapters 2, 7, 8, and 11, which has that intertestamental period. You know, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Grecian Empire, the Syrian Empire, all that. And then you have the prophecies concerning this Messiah who is to come, the historic Yeshua or Jesus of Nazareth. And then you have the last part of it. And again, we'll go over this more in detail if I can get this typed up for you by next week. And it's perseverance. Not only has it survived emperors who wanted it destroyed, but there are over 5,700 existing just Greek witnesses alone. That's not to mention Syrian, Georgian, Coptic, Latin. That's just Greek witnesses, or Greek manuscripts, Greek writings, right? The oldest goes back to the 2nd century. There's no other historical document that even comes close to the New Testament's veracity and witness record, right? So what I want to do is make that for you, make it short and concise, so that when people say to you, the Bible is just a mythological book written by these men, you can say, have you ever considered this? And just rattle off some of that stuff. And if they'll stand and listen to you, maybe it'll get them, and the Lord will use that to get them to think, wow, I never knew that, right? What do you think? Something you'd be interested in? Well, I'm doing it anyway, but I just wanted to get your approval beforehand. Yeah, Bill?
Well, even if you don't get something typed up, which would be great if it is, especially if you throw extra details in it, I'd be happy to just give you that.
Okay. I'd do that too. All right. Well, let's look at Revelation chapter 21. We're going to read verses 24 through 26. And we're going to look at, on our outline, this is new worship, right? Since the theme is God making all things new, it just seemed natural to keep this in that direction. We're going to be looking at new worship. Revelation chapter 21, verses 22 through 26. All right, so I trust that you're there. I saw no sanctuary in it. This is the New Jerusalem. For the Lord God, the Almighty, remember that phrase? He uses that over and over again. John does, the Pantocrator, the Supreme One. And the Lamb are its sanctuary, or are its temple. The city has no need of the sun or the moon to shine in it, for the glory of God has illumined it, and the lamp is the Lamb. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. And its gates will never be closed by day, for there will be no night there. And they will bring the glory and the honor of the nations into it, and nothing defiled, and no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever come into it, of course, because they've all been judged already, right, at this time, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. So we're talking about new worship, a new sanctuary, the temple, the naos, as the Greek term is. The temple is mentioned twice here in these two verses. It's translated sanctuary in my Legacy Standard Bible, but I know that the King James translates it temple, which is the usual term, is translated. What is the temple, right? We went through the outlines and looked at the various outlines of the temple and what it is and how many temples that there were. But the temple was that place where heaven and earth met. Remember, in the garden, there was no temple. There was just God in his presence with his people, right? But then what happens? Sin enters the world. Now there's a division. There's a heaven above and an earth below. So what do? They end up building first a tabernacle. And God's Shekinah glory is there. So it's kind of like that heaven on earth place where heaven and earth can meet because God's there now. See what I'm saying? The temple in that way. So we see that the tabernacle housed God's glory, that what we call Shekinah glory, and of course that's an extra biblical term. You won't find that word Shekinah in there, but it's illustrated in Exodus 13. That's where you get that concept of God's Shekinah glory. Remember, God leads them out of Egypt, pillar of cloud by day, fire by night, right? That Shekinah glory is what they call it. Solomon's temple is filled with that Shekinah glory, remember? Then it's destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. They go into captivity. They're in captivity. They're released by Cyrus. Zerubbabel and them build the temple. Herod then renovates the temple. AD 70, the temple's destroyed, right? And there's never the glory of God there. Never the glory of God there. And then there's that present time for us, that interim period, right? There is no temple. There's been no temple since AD 70. Now we have the Lord's body, he says, is the temple. It's where heaven and earth meet now in him, the divine and the earth, right? And then believers are said in 1 Corinthians 3:16, 6:19. We won't go to all the verses. 2 Corinthians 6:16 and Ephesians chapter 2. All say that now we are sort of mini temples. We're where God dwells on the earth, where people can see. Isn't that overwhelming to you, that thought that God dwells in you? And that the only God, so people who don't know God should be able to see God in and through you, right? We're these clay vessels, Paul says in 2 Corinthians. But there's going to be a time, obviously, where the Bible talks about 3 other temples. A third temple that's rebuilt, that's defiled. Jesus mentions it. Paul mentions it. It's mentioned by Daniel. It's called by some the tribulational temple. You can refer to it what you want, but you'll have to do something with those references. They are references to a future temple. And then, of course, we studied there's Ezekiel's temple. And in Ezekiel 43, the glory of God that left in Ezekiel chapter 10 and 11 returns. So now you have that Shekinah glory back in a literal building, and you have Messiah reigning, right? And then so now we get to the point in history, as it progresses, as it's been revealed to us, the new heavens and the new earth, this capital city, chapter 21 and verse 22, there is no more temple because the Lord God is the temple, right? He's brought back heaven and earth, and he fills it all, right? So there's no need for a temple. Now, the present heavens and earth, what about that? What do you think the Bible says today about the present heavens and earth? Is there a temple there? Can you think of offhand any passages that might talk about that? Anybody? What about chapter 3? Chapter 3 talks about a temple in heaven. Chapter 7, verse 15 talks about a temple in heaven. Chapter 11, verse 19. Chapter 14, several places. Chapter 15, verses 5, 6, and 8. Chapter 16, verses 1 and 17 of the book of the Revelation talk about voices and angels coming out from the temple of God in heaven. Right? What are your thoughts there? Anything? About a temple, a present temple being in the heavens? No? Are you awake? Do I need to call on you? Brad, do you want me to call on you? All right. I'm just seeing if you're awake. I wouldn't do that to you, Brad. All right. So there's new luminaries as well. Look at verse 23 of that 21st chapter. The city has no need of sun or moon to shine in it, for the glory of God has illuminated it, and the lamp is the Lamb. No luminaries. Remember, Genesis chapter 1, verse 14, God creates two great lights, one to rule the day, one to rule the night. The one to rule the day is the what? Sun. The one that rules the night is the... Well, how was there light before that? Because in Genesis 1:3, God says, let there be light, and there was light. But now he creates the luminaries on a later day. I think it's the glory of God that lightens it. Just like it'll be here in the future. The glory of God. And you can see the progression of this as well. In Genesis chapter 1, verses 14, 16, and 18, it talks about God creating the lesser days or the lesser lights, and the lesser light and the greater light, one to rule the day, one to rule the night. Then when you get into the tribulational time period, you see Matthew records, and then even Mark in the Synoptic Gospels. Let me read for you. Mark chapter 13, maybe verse 24. Matthew 13, 24, but in those days and after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give her light. Remember, all of the things that happened in the book of the Revelation, the stars fall from heaven, and God starts recreating, starts allowing the world to wind down to that 2 Peter passage where it's eventually dissolved. But during the millennial kingdom, what happens? Something happens, this renovation, this regeneration as it's called. Isaiah chapter 30 and verse 26. Do you recall that passage? Look at that. Or just write that reference down if you would. Isaiah chapter 30 and verse 26. If you get there before I do, you can read it out loud. 30 and verse 26. He says, and the light of the moon will be as the light of the sun, and the light of the sun will be 7 times brighter, like the light of 7 days. On the day Yahweh binds up the fracture of his people and heals the bruise that he has inflicted. He's talking about the millennial kingdom. During this millennial kingdom, the sun will be 7 times brighter than what it is. I don't understand what that's going to be like because I've never lived in that. But it's going to be 7 times brighter. The moon is going to shine like the sun does during that time period. But then when we get into the eternal state back in the book of the Revelation in chapter 21, there's no need of any sun nor moon because the glory of God lightens it. And you see that in chapter 21, verse 23, and then in chapter 22 and verse 5. And the Lamb is its light. From the word lukos, or white, that blistering white, like when you're driving, even more so, when you're driving during those winter days that are hot and really sunny, but it snowed, and you can't really hardly see because the snow's blinding you from the sun. Or some of you, like myself, have welded, and you've got an arc flash before, right, and burned your eyes. That brightness of that white and that's what we see on the Mount of Transfiguration. Remember when Christ, humanity is pulled back, and the disciples see that in Matthew 17, verse 2, and Mark 9, 3, and then in Luke chapter 9 as well. Let me read for you just one of those, if we can. And you already know these references, but just to remind you of them, Matthew chapter 17 and verse 2. He was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his garments became as white as light. Right? John sees this in the first chapter of the Revelation, doesn't he? Right? He sees this blistering, glorified Messiah. But if you look in the book of the Revelation, I know you have in chapters 3, 4, 6, 7, we share in that, right? That's why we always see pictures of portraits of heaven or of the millennial kingdom, and we're all dressed in white. That's where these artists get this imagery from. Revelation chapter 4. Let me just read a couple of those references for you as we get to that. Revelation 4, and around the throne were 24 thrones, and upon those 24 elders sitting, clothed in white garments. You see the same thing is mentioned in chapter 6 and verse 11 about the souls under the altar, and then in chapter 7, verses 9 and 13, after these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could count. And notice this, from John sees this distinction, and we're going to get into this, from every nation and all tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. And verse 13 says, one of the elders answered, saying to me, these, clothed in white robes, are they who have come. Where have they come from? He says, I don't know, you know. And he says that these are the ones who have come out of great tribulation and washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb, right? So that's where they get these artists get this imagery of white, right? Any thoughts so far? Now, what about these nations? Which is more biblical, you think? Nationalism or globalism? Ooh. Get some of you going here in a minute. Nationalism or globalism? I forgot. I gave a shirt that my company had give to me, to my daughter. You know, girls like those big shirts, sleeping or whatever. And it was green on the back, obviously, because that's the color now is green. And you had to really watch how the art was depicted on this picture. On the top was a target. And the target had an arrow and pointed down to the earth. And the target is globalism. And as soon as they gave me that shirt, I started laughing. And the guy that I work with, they always make fun of him because they think of him as a big how do you say it? Conspiratist. Is that how you say it? That's how they portray him. And I said, Trent, look, they're promoting one world globalism. And that's all he talked about the rest of the day. He had everybody riled up about that. Did you see what's on the back of our shirt? Globalism. And so he was going off about that. And everybody thanked me for getting him stirred up. So I say it's my pleasure. So Revelation chapter 21, verses 24 to 26. Now the Bible speaks of two distinct nations. Did you know that? I don't know if you've ever really thought about that or realized that. And I want to show you that. And this distinction is presented in Genesis and goes on into the eternal state. God does not erase your ethnic distinction in eternity. We just read that. John sees people from every tribe, tongue, kindred, and nation. If you're a woman here, you're going to be a woman there. If you're a man here, you're going to be a man there. Right? If you're from Europe, you're going to look like you're from Europe there. You're going to be a glorified-looking European, a glorified-looking Asian, whatever that is, but you're going to be you, but glorified. Right? Everybody's not going to look like Casper the Ghost. Right? Is that you, Wayne? Or no, that must be Andrew. Is that you? Is that you, Megan? No, that's not Megan. No. Right? You're going to know who each other is. That's what the Bible shows us. That's what we looked at when we looked at the resurrection. So the new nations, if you look up these terms, the Hebrew word is goy or goim, right? You've heard that term before. It's used over 300 sometimes, translated as nation. It's translated like 140 sometimes as heathen, translated 30 times as Gentiles, 11 times as peoples in the Hebrew Old Testament. And it's always used, the goyim, it's always used in distinction from the Hebrews or the Jews. Because the Hebrews or the Jews were created by God. You say, where do you get that from? Well, let's look at Isaiah 43. I've shared this with you before. Myself and Megan and Dan, who I hope you pray for, he just came out of surgery, all right, and Alicia are all studying systematically the doctrine of Israelology. That is Israel in the Bible. How the Bible teaches, what the Bible teaches about Israel, the nation. And it begins with their creation. Isaiah 43, look at verse 1 and then verse 15. But now thus saith Yahweh, your creator, O Jacob, he who formed you, O Israel, do not fear. I have redeemed you, I have called you by name, you are mine. You see the same thing in verse 15, right? If you look there, Isaiah 43, verse 15. I am Yahweh, your Holy One, the creator of Israel, your king. Have you ever thought about God as being the one who created Israel as a nation? What's your thoughts on that? Because I have some other stuff that might interest you or make you mad. All right? God created Israel as a nation. Now, you say that kind of is weird. I've never heard about that before. You've heard about that. You've read about God doing that. You've read about God wanting to do that, right? What about when Israel had sinned and Moses is leading them? And God tells Moses 3 different times in Deuteronomy 9, Exodus 32, and Numbers 14, stand back, let me destroy these people, and do what? What does he tell him? What does he tell Moses? With who? With Moses, right? Do you know those references? Look at Exodus 32 and verse 10. Somebody have one of those already? Exodus 32:10. Exodus 32 and verse 10 says, now, then let me alone, that my anger may burn against them, and that I might consume them, and I will make you a great nation. God tells him in the book of Deuteronomy Chapter 9, again, stand back and let me destroy this people, and I'll start over with you. So it shouldn't be inconceivable to think that God had created Israel as a nation. Remember, Abraham is a pagan in Ur of the Chaldees, right? What notable event took place in Ur of the Chaldees in Shinar? Do you remember? What did God tell the people to do? Did he tell them to go and build a name for themselves, or did he tell them to go and replenish the earth, subdue it, populate it, and all that? What do you think? Do you remember? Right? He told them to scatter over the face of the earth and replenish it, right? And what did they do in the land of Shinar? They built a tower, the Tower of Babel, right? And from the Tower of Babel, you had this mother-son cult worship develop, right? Do you remember what that is? Do you know what that is or no? Right? You have Nimrod, the great hunter, Semiramis, and then Tammuz. Their child who supposedly was devoured by a beast and then raised, right? It's based on that time period of his resurrection that Christmas is developed and all that sort of thing. And that's a whole other issue that comes out of the church. You say, that's not even in the Bible. Well, actually, it is. Right? How many of you know the references to this Tammuz in Jeremiah chapter 7 and Ezekiel? Somebody want to turn to that? Bill, would you turn to the Jeremiah references up here? Okay, if you can see them. Chapter 7, down here at the bottom, in chapter 44. And then, Tom, would you look at the Ezekiel 8? Now remember, the nations, right? They build a tower for their own glory. God comes down and he scatters them. He changes their language, confuses them, scatters them, right? Supposedly, according to Alexander Hislop, there was this mother-son cult worship that spread throughout the world. And you can see these examples I've given you. And you notice some of them, right? From Assyria, it's Ishtar and Tammuz, right? Phoenician is Astarte and Baal, right? The Grecians had Aphrodite and Eros. Or the Romans had Venus and Cupid, right? So we have these all over till you get up even into the Roman system, which is Mary and Jesus. Now, not to be irreverent, but if you have ever looked at any architecture in the medieval period, and I know Andrew's big into the history, you'll see stained glass presentations of Mary at the top and Jesus and God below her, because she is the Queen of Heaven. Where does that come from? Well, listen to these references in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and then you can kind of do a study on them later. This is why I think God calls Abraham out and calls him to be a nation. Remember, this is what we're studying in Genesis, what we've been studying. Jeremiah chapter 7.
The children gathered wood, and the fathers kindled the fire, and the women knead dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven, and they pour out drink offerings to other gods in order to spite me.
Right? And then chapter 44.
But rather we will certainly carry out every word that has proceeded from our mouths by burning sacrifice to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, just as we ourselves, our fathers, our kings, and our princesses did in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. But then we had plenty of food and were well off and saw no misfortune.
So when we worship the Queen of Heaven, we were doing all right. Now that we've turned back to God alone, Yahweh alone, we're being punished. We need to turn back to the Queen of Heaven. Right? Listen to Ezekiel's reference in Ezekiel chapter 8, verses 14 and 15. And again, all I'm saying is this is why I think that God calls Abraham, who was a pagan, out of Ur of the Chaldees and makes of him a new nation in which this mother-son cult worship is stopped. Okay? Ezekiel 8, verses 14 and 15.
Then he brought me to the entrance of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north, and behold, women were sitting there weeping.
Weeping for who? Tammuz. He is in the Bible. Right? So that's the reference. If you want to do further study on that, I encourage you to do that. It helps you a little bit better with the context of what was going on. You can see in Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 and 3, God says he calls Abraham out so that all the nations, the Goyim, will be blessed. All the families of the earth will be blessed through him. Right? Through him. You see that reminded, and we've seen it and preached on. Chapter 18 in Genesis, in verse 18. Let me just try to get through this if I can. Give you several passages. Since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed. All the Goyim will be blessed through him. He goes and he reminds, look at chapter 25 and verse 23. This progression and how God reaffirms this. It goes Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, and he's making a distinction. Just like he narrows down the promised seed, he separates his people from all the other nations. Right? And I'll give you a couple other more explicit passages. But in chapter 25 and verse 23 of the book of Genesis, I probably shouldn't take all this time to do this, but I do want to share some of these with you. Genesis 25 and verse 23, if I can get there. Okay, and Yahweh said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 peoples will be separated from your body. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Who's he talking about, Andrew? Jacob and Esau, the Edomites and the Jews. 2 different nations are in your womb. You see that? And you'll see this progression all the way through chapter 26, verse 4, chapter 46, verse 3, all the way through. In Leviticus 18, he makes a distinction between the Canaanites, the 7 tribes there that were not part of, they were separated, and how the Jews were not to be like them or be a part of them in Leviticus 18. Leviticus 26, he talks about how they're going to be punished and scattered over the whole earth because of that, right? There are many passages, and probably the best places to look is just to read Jesus' favorite Old Testament book, which was, what? Deuteronomy. Listen to Deuteronomy chapter 4 and let me do 5 through 8 and then verse 34, and I'll move on. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 5 through 8. See, I have taught you statutes and judgments, just as Yahweh my God commanded me, that you should do this in the land where you are entering to possess it. Remember the land of Canaan, where there are 7 other distinct nations. You shall keep and do them, for that is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples who will hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. Now, they're all pagan, but they're reading the laws of God and saying, these guys are pretty intelligent. That's exactly what I told you the other week that our founding fathers did. They read the Bible and they said, these principles and precepts, even though we don't really agree with the religious perspective, these are pretty wise principles and precepts to govern a nation by, right? For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as it's Yahweh our God whenever we call on him? Or what great nation is there that has statutes and judgments as righteous as this whole law which I'm setting before you today? And then notice verse 34 of that 4th chapter. Or has a God tried to go to take for himself a nation from within another nation, with trials, signs, wonders, with war, with a mighty hand, and with an outstretched arm, and with great terrors, as Yahweh your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? God has called the Jews out to be a distinct nation from all other nations. And we as Gentiles have 3 great blessings from that Jewish heritage. The Bible, the Bible's Messiah, and that coming kingdom. Right? And those are the 3 great blessings that we'll receive. Remember, according to Ezekiel 5 and verse 5, God has set Israel as the center stage of the earth. Not America, sorry. Right? But Israel, Ezekiel 5:5. Well, the Greek word, I'm not going to go through it, but it's the ethnos, right? Ethnics. And if you go through, you will see that they are contrasted with Israel over and over and over again. And especially, I've showed you this, it's in the past, it's in the present, and again in Revelation chapter 5 and 7, it will be in the future. There's a distinction. And there's a memorial, we even looked at it, created for the 12 tribes and for the church, the 12 apostles, in the construction and materials of the New Jerusalem. Remember when we talked about that? All right, let me give you this other one. Go on to this nation. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions, comments that you want to make? None at all? Yeah, Bill. It was just that mother-son cult worship that you see throughout all nations now. Even within the Catholic Church. I hated to say it like that, but because I don't want you to think that I believe every person in the Catholic Church is not possibly saved. But if you're following the doctrines, the teachings of the Roman Catholic system, yeah, that's troublesome. They just worship Tammuz. The mother-child worship, that veneration, which you see with every system today. Yeah.
As I listen to this, it sounds like what your least outgrowth with that is that there's been Israel and the nations from the beginning, and there's Israel and nations from the end. So the idea of discounting Israel or evaporating Israel from the economy of God does
Well, I don't think there's any biblical grounds for it, first of all. I mean, they've said, I think the reason why people don't acknowledge that there's Israel now and that there is a future, not just a future for Israel to be incorporated into the church, so to speak, but a future national regeneration, restoration, and reign of Israel. That's what I'm talking about. There will be that. The Bible is clear on that. I don't think you can get around that. And I think those who try to replace those promises have a hard time doing so. I'm sorry if that's the way you feel, but if you study Israelology, and if you want, I'll study it with you. Like I said, we're getting into the covenants now concerning that. But God has got to fulfill his covenant promises to the ones to whom they were made. And that's Israel, right? And they were promised nationally. Yeah.
We, in the church I went to for 4 years, we called ourselves adopted Jews. Plus we were saved. Adopted by God into the Jewish nation.
That's interesting. Yeah, Wayne?
You asked a rhetorical question a little earlier.
I did?
Yeah, and I wonder if your on, you said which is more biblical, globalism or nationalism?
Oh, yeah, so that's what we're getting to now. The Bible makes a distinction between the Jews and all other nations. The doctrine of the nations. Have you ever studied the doctrine of the nations? Systematized, meaning you've taken every passage that has to do with nations, ethnos, or goim, and studied that and systematized it. That's what Bible study is. You systematize topics like that. If you look at this and you trace this, you see the doctrine of nations as recognized starting with Babel. That's where a distinction is made. Languages are, that's where the term is first used in Genesis 10:5, and then verse 20 and verse 31. But you see when that was changed, and then you see then the author, then Moses goes back, even though he goes forward in Genesis 11, then he tells you the why the languages were confounded. So at the end of 10, and at the end, it tells you when they were changed, and then 11 tells you why. Now, I know you say, well, that's jumping around. That's not really chronological. Yeah, that's true. Daniel does the same thing. Isaiah does the same thing. It's done all throughout the Bible. You just have to recognize that. So, the doctrine of the nations, and you can see this in Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, Acts 17:26, where God allots each nation ground boundaries according to the children of Israel. That's what he says. He gives people their boundaries according to the nation of Israel. You see, during the Messianic reign, there's still a distinction. Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4 talks about the nations coming up to Jerusalem to worship the king. Or they go in Zechariah 14, when all the nations, again, there's no just one amalgam of everything. There's still a distinction in the millennial kingdom. That's what I want you to see, because it carries into the eternal state. We want to know what we're going to be like in the eternal state. You're going to be just like you are now, but glorified. You're going to be a glorified you. You're not going to be a ghost, an ethereal, formless spirit, right? You're going to be you, but glorified, and there'll be distinctions there. So during the Messianic reign, you see that, and you see the references I've given you. You can look those up, Isaiah 2, Isaiah 66. You can look at Revelation 12, verse 5, 19, 15, 20, verse 3. Again, nations. There's a distinction made. Even in the present heavens, according to Revelation 5 and 7, John sees all people, all different nations, tongues, tribes, kindreds, people. How does he know? If they're all ethereal, Casper-like looking people, how does he know? Because they're not. They're literal glorified people that he sees, right? Or they're in a state where their ethnicity is seen and recognized. And then back to our text, and this is why I'm driving it toward this. Back to our text in Revelation chapter 21, verses 24 and 26. The nations will walk in its light. The kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. In verse 26, and they will bring, that is the nations, they will bring their glory and honor of the nations into the eternal state. Right? They bring their glory into the eternal state. So I think that nationalism, Wayne, to answer your question, stands in opposition to globalism. Because men are in what condition? Fallen. Right? And so if you have a global community, like in Genesis 11, if you have a global community under whatever world leader, you're going to have a global fallen community. Right? Matter of fact, I don't know if you've read your Bible, but that's what this world is coming to. Right? Daniel chapter 7, verses 21 to 25. Let me read that for you. We got 10 minutes here. Daniel chapter 7. And then, Andrew, would you turn over to the book of the Revelation, chapter 13? Daniel chapter 7, verses, I just want to read several of these verses for you. And you know the context here, and we've studied this before. But Daniel chapter 7, and you can read chapter 2, 7, 8, 11, and so forth. But chapter 7, verses 21 to 25, listen to what is said here. I kept looking, and that horn was waging war with the saints and overcoming them, until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given in favor of the saints of the highest one, and the season arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. Thus he said, the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which will be different from all other kingdoms, and will devour the whole earth, and tread it down and crush it. As for the 10 horns, out of the kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them. He will be different from the previous ones, and he will make low 3 kings. He will speak words against the Most High and wear down the saints of the highest one, and he will intend to make changes in seasons and in law, and they will be given into his hand for times, and half a time. It's 3.5. I think that's the latter part of the tribulation. And notice, the saints will be given into his hands. That means those people who are saints during that time are not going to be preserved from judgment. They're going to be martyred. Right? Listen to chapter 13 of the book of the Revelation, verses 4 and 7.
And they worshiped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast, and who can fight against it? Verse 7, also it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them.
There you go. The dragon, who's identified as Satan, gives his authority to the beast, who is that last world leader, that little horn, to overcome the saints and to dominate the world. That's where globalism's going. One world government. It has been going there ever since the Tower of Babel. If you're in the industry like I am, automotive industry, they have ISO programs. Behind those ISO programs are Rockefellers, Bilderbergers, all of those people who are pushing one world community, globalism. Matter of fact, that was the platform of our current president. Why do you think they hated Trump so much? And I'm not being political, but I mean, he was nationalist. It was all about America. And then Biden comes and says, no, it's going to be all about the global green community. And what can unite us? A virus. Anyway, get off of that. That's my opinion, not the church's viewpoint, but it is mine. So in this New Jerusalem, the newness of these nations is seen in who they are, what they do, and why. And so we'll conclude with these verses, and you can see this. They're the saved nations who walk in its light. They're the saved nations who come through the Messianic kingdom. That's what he says here in verse 24. They're the saved nations. Now, why does he say they're the saved nations? Because they're those who rebel, remember? At the end, Revelation chapter 20, verses 7 through 9. Satan's released. He goes and he gathers nations to rebel against Jerusalem and the Messiah. And then God's immediate judgment, because remember, it's the millennial kingdom. God's immediate judgment, fire comes down from heaven. They're done. Right? They bring their honor and their glory, their fame, which they got from God, from Yahweh, because promotion comes from God, Psalm 75, verse 6. They bring that glory that was given them into the kingdom, right? It's not that they're coming in riding their fame and bragging about their fame. They're bringing that fame that they've been given by God back into the eternal state, and what they do with it is, of course, they give that glory, that praise, that honor back to him. And you see that in chapter 5 and chapter 19 in the worship of those who are in the eternal state, right? All right, so next time, what we'll do is we'll look at what our fellowship will be like. How will we glorify God? How will we worship God in eternity? Through our fellowship, through our service, through being fulfilled. God wants you to be fulfilled. He wants you to be satisfied through our satisfaction, number 4, through our rest, verse 5, through our rule and reign, and we'll glorify him obviously in our worship, in adoring him, right? So we'll look at those 8 aspects of what life will be like throughout eternity, and then we'll answer and ask the question, what about time? Is there time in the eternal state? All right? Any closing thoughts then? Hey, I just want to know, I appreciate your even showing up. Honestly, I know sometimes it's taxing, and some people don't like sitting through this kind of teaching. I totally get that and understand it. We're going to have more practical teaching as Jeremy and Luke. Is it just Jeremy and Luke? Do you know, Andrew?
I think so.
Mainly Luke, but Luke and Jeremy are going to be doing some more hands-on type stuff, and I'm sure it's going to be great. It always is. So again, I appreciate you enduring these 4 months that we've been teaching. So we have next week, and we'll conclude with what life will be like for us in the millennial kingdom, or not millennial kingdom, eternal state, new heavens, new earth, and will there be time? And I'll hopefully have that outline for you to give you that as far as to talk to your friends, family members about the Bible, the characteristics of the Bible. Okay? Any closing thoughts there? Yeah, Bill.
I'm going to throw out a potential theory of mine, and if you think that's answered either at all or maybe this week, but I want to get your thoughts on a theory that I have of that the Antichrist and the beast are two separate entities.
When we talk about like the president, we can use a term to denote the office as well. So there's the beast system, and then there's the leader of that system who also has a religious Billy Graham, so to speak. That's how I understand it.
My potential theory has been for many years is that when the scriptures speak of a beast, that I've always thought, especially in the description of how it will function and what it will do and how it will control, is that I believe that that's potentially AI, and the Antichrist will be the human form of control.
So are you going to teach that then? Oh, well, I was getting excited. I'll sit in on that.